afternoon, everyone. It's Tuesday, October 13th, 2020. So welcome to the Northeast Regional Virtual Conference for the Social Studies. This is a keynote session. And we have Christopher Martell, who's an assistant professor, social studies education at UMass Boston, high school teacher, social studies teacher for 11 years. He was taught at Framingham public schools for about 8 of those 11 years. And he was a professor at Boston University. I think that's where I met you when you were at Boston University. He wrote a number of books. And today he's going to be talking about teaching social studies for justice. And so here's Chris. Thanks for talking.
Thanks, Gorman, and thanks for everybody for being here. I know it's tough in these current times to attend conferences, period, and it's especially putting in a virtual conference in your busy schedule. It's greatly appreciated. It's also nice to see so many friendly faces, people that I've worked with in the past. So thank you for coming. I'm going to share my screen now. And give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides. All right, great. And I need to make sure I can see, I need to be able to see the chat I'm trying to figure out how I can share my screen and see the chat. Is that possible, Goran? I'll just stop sharing my, oh no, I can see it. I got it. I'm pulling it up now. I got it. Sorry. Like everybody, I am continuously learning new things about Zoom. So, all right, great.
That too,
so as Gorman said, I'm Chris Martell. I'm now at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And the title of my presentation is Teaching Social Studies for Justice, Reimagining History and Social Science Classrooms Around Activist Thinking. For those of you that have seen me speak before, this is kind of a new topic. It's based on a book that Kayleen Stevens, who's at Boston University, and I have coming out in December with Teachers College Press. So it'll be some new stuff. So you won't hear me talk about the same stuff I sometimes talk about. So it's a similar theme though, of course. So I started the presentation with these two images. They're both from Boston. One is in the 1960s. It's Boston Public School students and parents protesting for the desegregation of the Boston Public Schools. And the second picture are Boston students this last summer protesting the unjust killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others. And I start with this because I want us to think about how we got here and why does this continue, and maybe how some ways that our students can hopefully work to change it. So I want to start with a little brainstorm. So if you can open your chat box, and what I want us to write in the chat box are just type in some of the topics of units we teach in a US history course. So just type in some common units that we teach in US history. It could be in elementary US history or middle school or high school US history. I'll kind of read out some of the units we have there. So we have American Revolution, sometimes a thing. World Wars, Civil War to Civil Rights Movement, boom and bust, conflict, colonial America, Hamilton and Jefferson, Reconstruction, progressivism. Great. Okay, we're gonna pause for a second. Okay, let's do the next one. What about a world history course? What are some of the units that we'll often see in a world history course? Oh, world wars again. Imperialism, the Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, rise of dictators, African colonialism, modern, whatever, fill in the blank country. Thanks, Jay. French Revolution, I feel like that's a standard. Some people are thematic, so religion, philosophy of government, genocide, nationalism. All right, let's try another topic, another discipline, I mean. How about in a civics course? What are some of the units in a civics course? Or government course, federal system, the revolution, the Constitution, voting in elections, the three branches of government, Constitution, structures of government, media literacy, judicial system. All right, and one more, simulation, Boston busing. Okay, last one, and because we could go through all the different disciplines of social studies, but let's just throw together geography and economics. What are some of the topics we teach there? Supply and demand, that's a big unit in economics. Map, test, that's very true. Marxism, thinking like a geographer, 5 themes of geography, that's a common organizer of our courses. Geopolitics, cultural geography, climate change. Take maybe 1 or 2 more. Scarcity, monetary and fiscal policy. Sometimes we'll see a unit on corporations or business organizations, natural resources again. All right, great. So I'm gonna put our pause on our chat, but one of the things I want to kind of bring up, this was a little bit of a thought exercise. I want us to think about how we organize our social studies classes. So very commonly, we'll see social studies classes organized around important rulers. I saw someone put in, Jefferson, the age of Jackson, Victorian England, the Tang Dynasty. So oftentimes we'll take one person and organize a whole unit around them. Oftentimes our units will be around institutions of power. So the Congress, the Supreme Court, which is particularly relevant today with nominees hearings going on. In economics, we might see business organizations, supply and demand. In geography, oftentimes it's around separate regions. We separate the world into different places. Granted, Spain is very different than Russia, but we put them all together in a European unit. Or, thinking about South America, Brazil is very different than Mexico, but they're all in one big unit. So I'd like to put forward an argument that how we traditionally organize social studies units speaks to a fundamental flaw in how we're approaching the teaching of it. And I think this fundamental flaw keeps perpetuating some of the problems in society that we're seeing. Right here, this is protesters near Franklin Park in kind of the Dorchester-Roxbury line in Boston, protesting after the killing of George Floyd. And, I and Kayleen Stevens, who's a co-writer with me in this endeavor, are really asking, how do we ensure that more citizens take these actions? And what can history and social science education do to foster that? And so when we look at our units that are emphasizing individuals or institutions with power, I just stole some chapter headings from typical textbooks. So, you've got in a US history textbook, you'll often see a chapter on the early European explorers or government, the presidency, Jeffersonian era, and an economics textbook, business organizations. Oftentimes our textbooks will actually separate the globe into different worlds. I find it really interesting, a chapter that's positioning itself as if there's a Muslim world, as if Muslims are not part of the larger world, or that we could easily put a box around what is Southwest and Central Asia. Or oftentimes at the beginning of American history, we'll talk about 3 worlds meeting, which implies that these different worlds came together. Or, we have whole courses that are sometimes called Western civilization, implying that there's a special type of civilization in, say, Europe. And our state standards do this as well. You know, NERC is the Northeast social studies. When you look across all of the Northeast and the different curriculum frameworks that states use, most of them also organize around these same units. And so one of the questions I thought about is, where do these units come from? Why are we all using the same grammar to make rules on what we're teaching? And it really is an interesting question that dates back over 100 years. The units that we're using today were created in the 1800s, and textbooks use those same units, and then teachers often use those textbooks to organize their units. So here's an, you know, I do a lot of work with elementary teachers. So this is an elementary textbook, geography for little learners. And they organized it around kind of European conceptions of the continents. Here's a page from Africa. You wouldn't be surprised that there are lots of kind of stereotypes of African people and what is the African diaspora in here. And on the right is a high school textbook on American history. Has a whole chapter on how, literally the title is How Columbus Discovered America, and, you know, describes a European perspective. And so if you dig a little deeper, I would make the argument that these units are often rooted in white supremacy. If you know who Herbert Spencer is, you know, kind of the developer of scientific racism, took, you know, the idea of, you know, Darwin's evolution and applied it to human races. He actually, in some of his writing, advocates that we teach Western civilization, and he essentially makes the case it proves that Europeans are superior. Around that same time, in the 1890s, the American Historical Association released a report from the Committee of Seven, which was 6 white men and 1 white woman. It was nice that they did include a woman on the committee, but it certainly didn't represent the diversity of the United States or the world at that time. And their report essentially says the curriculum should focus on European and white American civilization. And, you know, we've made some progress. There's a backlash at different periods. I want to note a few. Carter G. Woodson in the 1920s made a major push for Black History Month, teaching of Black history in our schools, arguing that African Americans needed to reclaim the curriculum in much the way that W.B. Du Bois was arguing for. This is kind of the era of what was then dubbed the New Negro, you know, and kind of re-envision the education system for Black children. It appears again in the 1960s and 70s. We have, you know, attempts to make the curriculum more multicultural. We have freedom schools in the South. To the left here is the Black Panther Party that made liberation schools in Oakland and other cities to teach Black history when children weren't getting it in schools. On the right is San Francisco State in their ethnic studies strike in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, demanding that ethnic studies be taught at the university level. And a lot of this, there were ethnic studies strikes among high school kids in LA and in Texas and places like Crystal City. And then there was another backlash that's been rising recently. You know, if you've been following the kind of ethnic studies debate, there was a vibrant ethnic studies program in Tucson, Arizona, and then the Arizona legislature banned ethnic studies, and recently a court has overturned that law. The New York Times has published the 1619 Project recently that really forced many Americans, not just school children, to think about, you know, when did our nation start? Where do we mark the beginning of racism? And what does it mean in 1619 with a ship of enslaved people coming to the Americas? But there's also been a backlash to the backlash. So here in Massachusetts, you know, while our curriculum frameworks are better than they were certainly better than they were in previous generations, we could, you know, I'm hoping in the future the next generation will be even better. When they were released, the Pioneer Institute, a conservative think tank here in Boston, attacked them using language that they didn't have enough Western civilization and didn't root America's founding in Europe enough. Or I'm sure you followed the president recently demanding that we need patriotic education to stop the radical movement of left-wing indoctrination in our schools. I'm just reading quotes of what he said. And so, you know, what is going on here? What is the outcome of this curriculum? And so I think we need to think about, what does it mean that we're primarily teaching powerful leaders, powerful institutions, and the world is really separate regions. And without a doubt, there's a reason to teach all of those groups. But when we center them in our classroom, what message is it telling students and citizens? And you know, I had to put this picture up here because I love it. Looks like I love these activities where it's you know, like a round table or maybe some sort of meal that all these famous leaders are having where they can talk about an issue. But I wonder if that might also be sending the wrong message about who's the one who gets to decide the future and change. And so what I would argue is that it leads to three issues. One, that our students often leave K-12 and university education thinking that one leader in the past made change. So Abraham Lincoln, you'll hear this over and over again from adult Americans, that Abraham Lincoln ended slavery. Instead of, there were centuries and definitely decades of movements saying we need to end slavery. Or Martin Luther King ended segregation. And without a doubt, there's still racial segregation in America. And without a doubt, Martin Luther King, although very important, was one voice in a sea of many voices. Another problem I think it presents is that students and citizens look for one leader in the present to make change. Whether you supported Barack Obama or you supported Donald Trump, I think both of their candidacies offered hope to people that one leader could change a very large and complex system in certainly very different political ways. But it's leading a lot of Americans to feel let down because those one leaders couldn't provide the change they were expecting. Yet we know as historians and social scientists that it's really people organized in movements from ancient times, from the earliest humans to today, that have caused change in our societies. And this is leading to some Americans not even trusting in those movements of people. And I would argue, in part, I don't appreciate when people blame an education system for having the symptoms that a larger society has. But our education system could be working against those problems. And so here, in a Pew Research poll from a few years ago, a majority of Americans do not believe past or present movements have made the United States better. This includes the labor movement. All of these rate below 50%. So 30% or 40% say the labor movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, LGBTQ rights movements, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. For a brief moment this summer, Black Lives Matter reached almost 60%. And the latest polls have pushed it back down to below 50% of Americans believe it made America better. Only the civil rights movement, and this is only maybe in the last 20 years, has consistently in this poll from Pew been rated as positive by Americans. And I think in some ways because they look to Martin Luther King and an important leader as making America better, and they feel that it was a success. And then a third problem is that groups in power think everything is just fine. And again, we see a slight change for that this summer with white Americans, but again, we see it kind of pulling back to where it was before. This is again coming from a different Pew survey, but 37% of white Americans feel the country must go further. That means that the opposite feel that it must not need to go further. It related to equal rights for people of color. 42% of Americans feel that more progress is needed in gender equality. Again, the majorities feel it's not. 37% of middle and upper class Americans believe that the advantages in life, advantages in life are a main factor in personal wealth. The reverse of that feels that it's related to personal hard work or meritocracy. So what can we as social studies teachers do about this? And so I'm going to make, again, an argument that we need to radically rethink how we teach social studies. And in the chat box, when everyone was kind of contributing their ideas, many schools and departments and teachers are doing this work. They're reorganizing their units. I saw in your chat box, some of those units weren't like Jacksonian America. They were social change, or, you know, we're doing thematic organization of social studies, or we could even teach chronologically, for instance, in some history courses, but thinking about who we're calling our units about, right? So with that, we not only need to think about the organization or the structure, but we also need to think about the content. And I would like to highlight specifically voices that are routinely missing. And how can we move those voices into the center? We often teach history through a white, a man, middle to upper class, a native born, a straight kind of view of the past or the present, and then we kind of add in groups. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I'd like us instead to center those groups that traditionally haven't been the ones we focused on. And with this, I would argue that's how we would seek justice, or some people might say social justice, in our curriculum. And one thing that makes me really happy is, despite many social studies book publishers or curriculum, and believe me, there are some great curriculum that are doing this work, but curriculum writers and traditional kind of setups of education, our students are doing this on their own. This is the climate strike from the last couple of years, and you know, the students will sometimes on their own kind of rewrite the curriculum in their mind to be around activist thinking. And that's really my core argument, is we need to center activist voices in the past and the present, so that our students know that they're not alone, that when they go and participate in the climate strike or anti-gun violence protests, or even protests about getting their schools more funding, that they're part of larger and historic movements. And so many of us in social studies know the work of different groups of people who have asked us to focus our students' thinking on different ideas. And whether it's history or political science or geography or economics, there's a group of people who've been advocating to get your students to think like a historian or think like a social scientist. And this is very important work. Sam Weinberg, I'm sure most of us have read his book, had PD perhaps around it. The folks at the Stanford History Educators Group are putting out some great stuff. And they argue that we need to think about how experts versus novices think of the world. It's a very cognitive psychological perspective, and that we need to teach students to use the thinking processes of professional historians or social scientists. About 10, 15 years later, another group led by Keith Barr and Linda Levstick, but certainly many others in history and in social sciences, argued that's not enough, that on top of thinking like disciplinary thinking, we need to focus on citizenship thinking and democratic thinking. And they kind of outlined a set of ways to think like a democratic citizen. What Kayleen and I are really putting forward in our new book is that and that last framework was from sociocultural theorists, people like Lev Vygotsky, that we learned together in community. Building on those first two, Kaylee and I are saying, and bringing in some critical theory, we're saying that we instead want to argue that we need to center the idea of thinking like an activist, thinking like people in movements, and how they change the past and how they're changing the present. And so I'll highlight that. So where does the framework come from that we're trying to put forward? And Kaylee and I stepped back and we said, okay, so if we're going to be teaching students to think like activists, where do we learn what makes a movement successful? And so we really are looking at three people: Angela Davis, who did a lot of work throughout her career about race, gender, sexism, racism, classism, and how they intersect. We look at Bill Moyer, not the PBS person, but he was an anti-war activist, a civil rights activist. We also look to George Lackey, who was an nuclear activist and has organized numerous protests at nuclear reactors. And we said, what have they told us about building movements? What have they told us about making change in society? And kind of collectively, we took ideas from those three and we said, when you're teaching students to think like activists and to think about how movements created change, we saw really these three parts. And those activists tend to use the civil rights movement to illustrate how those movements created change. And so we argue that the first component we should get students to think about is what Moyer actually calls cultural preparation. He argued, and I think to some degree Angela Davis argues this, that we are imprisoned by the world that we currently live in. That to make change, we have to imagine a world that's different than the world we live in. And this is a really fun activity to do with students because especially the younger they are, the more they see that the world could be different, the more they can imagine something that's not the current world. In fact, as we get older, our imaginations start to get dimmer because we lived in this world for so long, we can't imagine it to be different. And so when we look at, SCLC or CORE or the NAACP, these were groups during the Civil Rights Movement that had, NAACP dating back to its founding in the early 1900s, envisioned a different society. So if you're looking at world history and you're looking at Industrial Revolution, you want to look at who's envisioning a different society at the beginning of that period. The next step would be getting students to think about critical analysis. This is where movements think about what structures are in place that are causing oppression. What would need to be done to educate the public about an issue, to get them to think about it differently? How could we create an alternative to the status quo that would benefit all? And again, SCLC, CORE, NAACP, and then later groups like the Black Panthers or Nation of Islam, numerous other groups began to think about, okay, how do we change the public's mind? How do we get them to see that the world could be different? And then once you've done those first two steps, it's much easier to engage in collective action. This is where Angela Davis, Bill Moyer, James Lackey argue that often failure starts to happen because you might envision a new society, but you don't have the tools to change that society. And so they argue in some different forms that there often is a trigger event. I think this summer, well, actually starting last winter with the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, that was a trigger event for a new phase of Black Lives Matter. Was there a trigger event that got the public to raise its attention? What was done around that trigger event? Did the movement gain support? Where did the movement fall short? How did it change how did collective action change society, or did it change society? And is there a legacy of that today? And here, again, historical example, the civil rights movement, a lot of times students can point to Rosa Parks or maybe Martin Luther King's leadership during the Montgomery bus boycott, but they have a hard time seeing how that was part of a much larger movement, and Rosa Parks sitting on the bus was just a trigger event, a planned trigger event to raise awareness. But then what do we do in our classrooms? What do we use in regards to pedagogy to get students to start seeing how history could be organized around movements and around social change? And so, Kaylee and I again argue that there are these three areas that we want students to get opportunities to engage with in your classroom. So for a long time, we've been advocating in social studies for inquiry-based instruction. That goes back to Sam Weinberg in the 90s, thinking like a historian, having students ask questions, gather evidence, reach conclusions based on that evidence, oftentimes refer to it as source work, where students use sources to take stances. But we would argue, based in many ways on Cynthia Salinas's work around critical inquiry, we'd argue that we need to make these inquiries social, that students can be inquiring around anything. And in fact, they could be inquiring around the same groups in power, like what did George Washington think of a particular event, when we really should be asking about focuses of power. And so who had the power to change something? What are the counter narratives to that power? And was there a push for change in those moments? And here I also want to say we need to be very careful to not essentialize non-dominant groups. Oftentimes, the civil rights movement is a perfect example. We act as if there was one civil rights movement and one view from Black America of what civil rights was, when there were many views of the civil rights movement. And it's important to have students see that there are these conflicting ideas of how the civil rights movement should be engaged. The second point we like to raise is that traditionally the social studies curriculum aimed to assimilate students, going back to Spencer in the 1890s. Well, he certainly wasn't a multiculturalist, but even some of the early multiculturalists, it was to get everyone to be part of one e pluribus unum, if we'll call it that, but one that's primarily fitting other groups into the dominant group's view. This is the exact, it's not ironic that in the 1890s they're teaching in textbooks like how did Columbus discover America, and they're also trying to assimilate indigenous people through Indian boarding schools into acting and being white. And so here, other people's experiences are told in the mainstream narrative, and they've gotten a little better, but look in your textbooks, you'll see Sitting Bull is more likely to probably be a sidebar, even in a chapter on so-called closing of the frontiers, than being the main narrative of it. So we'd argue that it needs to be critical. And so traditionally, when we do bring in multiculturalism, some people have said it's a more liberal view of multiculturalism, which by all means, it centers kind of tolerance and learning to live together, which is certainly important. We don't think that's a bad thing at all, but that is what Sonia Nieto calls a kind of low level of support for people of color, for other groups. Whereas we would say curriculum should really ask questions about fairness, about equity. So who is being treated fairly and who's not? And with this, noticing that some people, it's more fair than others, and that some groups have more power than others, which leads to our third kind of encouragement for what in your classroom would be helpful to do. And that is to realize the end isn't necessarily just to know the past or just to know facts about the present in geography or economics or civics, but instead to be a space for transformative citizenship. To see that as a citizen, and I use citizen very broadly here, not necessarily meaning a documented citizen, but as a member of your local, national, or global communities, that you have the power as a citizen of those communities to undo what's happening. So traditionally civics, I know there's a lot of groups that are doing this work and we need to borrow their ideas, but traditionally civics has been done to justify or uphold current power arrangements. Students and teachers often view it as learn the facts about government and be sure to vote, minimum participation necessary, and now can be a citizen. And we would argue that we need to go much further than that, that your role as a citizen is to think about fairness and who is being treated fairly, and that then the next step is what levers of democracy can you take to make society better? So if you see a problem, how can you as a citizen engage in it? And with this, I want to also note, we definitely view history and the social sciences as political. We all use our political ideologies to understand the world around us, and that's not a bad thing. We actually want to expose political ideologies. It's problematic when people don't understand there's some ideology kind of framing a problem. But we want this to be not partisan. And we're getting into such a hyper-partisan society that we won't even listen to those who come from different political beliefs. That is going to lead to a collapse of our democracy. And ultimately, that's what social studies is trying to prepare citizens to work against. So here, that's really all I have to say, and I hope this can turn into a bigger conversation. I do got to give my book plug for what's coming out in December, but you can actually pre-order it now. And then there's a quick kind of URL if you want to go check it out. And then I will leave it here. Hopefully, it's a good place for questions or conversation. I would love some pushback on some of the ideas I'm putting forward here. Some ideas from your classroom that you've done, ways that you've taught justice in history and the social sciences, and use our rest of our time to keep learning here. So, all right, I'm gonna turn off my screen sharing so it can be more like a conversation. And feel free if you don't want to like undo your camera, and like, you know, you can ask a question just using your volume. I'll also be trying to keep an eye on the chat, which I absolutely couldn't see while presenting because that's the way Zoom works. But I'll be keeping an eye on the chat too to answer questions there. So I'll open up the floor and maybe we can chat about this. So Jay, you've asked, can you ask a question first? So you get to lead us.
All right, thanks, Chris. Good to see you again.
See you
my main question sort of, and what I would see as a potential obstacle for most of us in the regular classroom is you're doing your day job, X amount of hours up to the day. To revamp a curriculum is obviously taking a fair amount of time. You and Kayleen are doing a great amount of work on the side in your research. How can we, as the everyday teacher, streamline that so that we can make more progress faster and get to that end result to do this kind of quality work?
And that's like such an important question, Jay. And I think, you know, normally I would answer, this takes time, and that's true. And it doesn't happen overnight, and that's true even for the most kind of experienced educator. But I think as this summer and past summers and in numerous events in the last decade have shown us, like, the time is now, like this needs to happen now, right? So what I would say is there's kind of three things we need to do. The first is realize that it still will be slow. Like, it's unfair to expect a teacher to completely redo their curriculum in a summer, you know, and then like, now I'm teaching for justice and everything's great, right? So, but, you know, as you're looking at your lesson plans, just have in the back of your mind of how can I center a different group here? Like normally, I think about the age of Jackson as like the great example in a US history class of like, we teach it all around Jackson, like as if Jackson was more important than, even though we call it kind of the era of the common man, like I guess Jackson was the only common man, right? So in that unit, you know, start by changing the title of that. Start by, you know, maybe not call the age of Jackson, but call the age of the common person or something. And then ask the question, was this the age of the common person or not? Next, start bringing in new lessons when you can, or and you know, new questions that you might ask of the same documents you're using before, and then kind of bring in new documents that might help answer that question, right? The second thing is don't do this alone. So we know that, you know, we often live in these egg crates in schools. You've probably heard that before, right? Like everyone's in their own classroom, and I think COVID-19's made that even more the case because we're now in our own like hybrid bubbles, or we're our own remote bubbles, or so what you need to do is work with others. So I think about Taylor Collins, who's a teacher at Framingham High School where I used to teach. And the last 2 years, she's been trying to center Indigenous Native voices in her US history curriculum. So she got together with a colleague, Danielle Fernandez, and they together have been like making a list of like old documents they want to throw out and new documents they want to bring in. And they've been kind of slowly working on new lesson plans and sharing with each other, right? And this is where you might be able to use your department, like use your department time to think about how will we build better lessons that include groups that are often missing, or focus on movements and activists. And then the third part is, you know, some of this stuff exists out there already, right? So, you know, and many of you I'm sure know the Howard Zinn Project and Teaching Tolerance and Facing History in Ourselves. And, you know, Dave was on here, iCivics and Primary Source, and, you know, there's like so many different groups out there. So snag the materials when you can from elsewhere and realize that you don't have to build everything from scratch. So I don't know if that's kind of a long-winded answer, Jay, but like I just like how movements built the past together, like teachers should, there's not like this like one individual powerful teacher that can like change the whole world of teaching, right? So I would say have that same activist teacher movement kind of spirit.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Anne? I think you're muted.
Hi there. First of all, this is fabulous, and it's. I'm glad that this work is being done. And in the interest of full disclosure, I am retired, so a lot of this stuff is actually new-ish to me. My response in looking at all this is that many of those charts can be folded into one another. I don't think the Stanford people would argue that they have an issue with some of the questions you're offering. I would say what yours is kind of a child of that stuff. Sure. And as someone who introduced new curriculum into schools, having teachers create lessons around the Stanford questions is challenging and hard enough. Mm-hmm. And but I can see there are ways in which a lot of your questions can be overarching and asking who has the power, how do you know, what are the challenges to power or to leadership. Those are things that can be, in fact, woven into lessons. And so that would be my suggestion to the actually the very important questions that Jay has raised. And last but not least, I'm going to go back to the ancient social studies. And because I once did a presentation at UCLA on the history of history curriculum. Yeah. And I'm going to mention something that none of you have ever heard of, but the person's called Hilda Taba. And I suggest, oh, look, that is.
I know a little bit about her. She,
because she comes from a very particular time period. It was after World War II. People were still digesting or beginning to digest the Holocaust, and how could people do these things? And she picked out a handful of important concepts that could be rotated again and again and again into curriculum. So you could start with the issue of power with first graders and have it be more and more complex as you went up the scale. And by engaging kids, particularly kids who have not considered part of mainstream, to learn how to ask questions when looking at documents and things like that, are preparing them for activism.
Yeah.
And that's my 2.5 cents or 0.5 cents response to a lot of what this has done. So, Christopher, I think this is fabulous, and you make me wonder why I retired because I was tired, but.
Well, certainly retired teachers have a lot to offer here, and maybe you'll in some capacity work with beginning or more experienced teachers, and you can definitely advocate for Hilda Taba, especially because I think we've forgotten. I saw Rob Powers also loves her work, like this idea that we need to keep working the same concepts over and over again more and more deeply, right? So, and in the book, Kaylee and I have, after we kind of have some of our theoretical underpinnings, we have practical chapters where we paint these vignettes of teachers at different levels. So we start with a high school US history classroom, and then a high school world history classroom, but also a middle school ancient history classroom and a elementary local history classroom. And we ask, what would those look like if they were doing this? Because we want people to see that spiral, that this isn't something that just happens once in high school. Like that would be like putting Sitting Bull in the margins of a textbook, right? So how do we keep asking those questions about power and fairness? And I do a lot of work with first graders. They are very attuned to fairness, and they can really assess, who's getting what and why. And anyone that has small children also knows that. So, and I will say with ancient history, when we first started doing this, a lot of people would say, well, you can't do that in ancient history because there weren't activists and movements in the ancient past. And there's a whole book we use that basically says that the ancient civilizations of the world all had different movements causing change, and that we need to stop thinking of history as progress, right? Like, there were women leaders in the ancient world. Like, if we go back to the beginning of humanity, there were like movements that had a lot of women power in decision making for communities, right? And prehistoric times. So you know, we need to rethink these structures that were put into place. And just my final thought about, say, like the Sheg stuff and Sam Weinberg's crew. I think you're right that a lot of this work already does it, but when you in preparing for this book, we kind of looked at some of their materials, and you'd be surprised, like they still often focus on important individuals. Like they'll do like Rosa Parks' lesson plan, right? As opposed to, let's talk about the movement for desegregation in Montgomery, right? Which she was a part of this larger movement. So they have a few good ones. Like there's one on women's work in the early 20th, in the 1920s, which we were like, oh, they're kind of getting at movements here, you know, like women as workers and who are changing society. But this would, we hope that this will, because we're not competing. We do think there's a place for thinking like a historian and thinking like a democratic citizen, but we're saying, but throughout both of those two, definitely think about movements and activists. So.
Oh yeah, and I think that part of, I guess I would argue that that they're not mutually exclusive,
right?
And that just being trusting kids to ask complex questions and to get into the habit of asking these questions in and of itself is transformative.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to take over, but I would say the way you set up your classes, that you really try to minimize the chalk and talk kind of stuff, throwing your net wide and having kids believe that they have something to add, in and of itself is a revolutionary. So I would argue, looking at historians who have done social history, I'm not going to use the X word anymore because we don't have to do that, but finding excerpts from those that talk about ordinary citizens being involved and things like that. So anyways, I think you do great stuff, and I am going to shut up now.
Thanks, Ann. Rob?
Yeah, Chris, thank you so much for this. I think this is really helpful in conceptualizing, because a lot of teachers, you know, want to become better at critical pedagogy and widening the lens, but don't really know how to start. And I think this articulates that. I'm curious what you think. So you mentioned earlier that I've been thinking a lot about this with my colleagues, you know, the difference between political and partisan. And the reality is that schools are, you know, political sites, whether we want them to be or not. And, you know, teaching through this approach, especially if you try to link this to taking informed action or make contemporary connections, like you said, with the climate strike, is inherently political. And again, as social studies teachers, we know that that's not a bad thing. That's actually like what we're here to do. Right. Do you have any thoughts on how to articulate that for non-social studies administrators or community members or school committees in communities that maybe don't necessarily, you know, think that that is the role of a school, especially given that communities run their schools, right? So how do you make that argument for critical pedagogy in a community that maybe has been hearing the talking points about why that's not good for their kids?
Right, and I would say those are the communities where this work definitely needs to be done, because we need critical lenses on the world. Gloria Latson-Billings a few years ago made an important point that she encouraged us in education to move away from the term social justice and use just justice, because even now social justice has become, in this partisan world, like hyper politicized, and you know, it's seen as a leftist idea. And we should, regardless of political beliefs, we should all be seeking justice. Like that is a constitutional foundation. That is like, and so we're gonna, making the political clear is important. A lot of people, especially some historians, don't like Howard Zinn's work. The current president has made that clear, right? But Kayleen and I, in our book, argue he's one of the best political historians, because he's making clear like what perspective he's interpreting the past through, right? And so there are excellent conservative historians that do the same thing. In fact, you know, historians throughout history, we used to be organized around political views, like the Whig historians and the Federalist historians, right? And it's the same for social scientists. They make very clear, like often, like here is my political perspectives that might frame my work. And so in some ways, I think those communities, you remind them that we're focusing on justice, and your different some people's justice definitions come from their religious views. Some people's justice conceptions come from their cultural views. Some people's justice definitions come from their political views. We can't solve the problems, though, of unfairness unless we all are at least seeking justice. And we're going to come at it from different approaches. So that I have found in my years of teaching, and I hope I just keep getting better with this, but even in my earlier years, my conservative students would love my class because I also wouldn't marginalize their views. Like, liberals don't own justice, like, so you tell me what your definitions of fairness and justice are, and then we're going to work from that. And I also think it's an opportune time to always position it as there are a lot of people's stories that haven't been told. And so regardless, we're going to ensure by having more stories be part of the stories that make up the past and the present, we get to understand the world better around us. And sometimes in kind of somewhat insular and maybe relatively homogenous communities. I have a friend who lives in Wilmington, Massachusetts. I'll throw down that community. And she was trying to get the local library to put in more kind of books about people of color and other groups. And they were like, well, no one's going to take out those books here because they're not going to see themselves in the books. And so it also had Rob, it's about telling the community that, in fact, this is the most important place to have those books because it's telling the experiences of people you might not interact with, right? So we need to expose political views, but remind everybody that no one set of political views is the only set we should be guided by. I think that was what was most troubling about this new patriotic education speech that the president recently gave, because it basically said my vision of the world and my political views are the ones that should be taught, right? And so I guess it's tough because when you have a media landscape that might politicize social justice, it's about reminding people that we're all seeking it and we might find different lenses on our understanding of that. I don't know if that totally helps answer your question, but and Jody added, unfortunately, the Dunning School to the previous conversation.
One of the thoughts I had, in thinking of reframing, like the curriculum, I think one of the challenges when you're thinking of, introducing or addressing different perspectives in history, one of the challenges or what's tricky is you don't want to make it seem like it was an add-on, right? It's like you described, it's that box in the textbook, so in thinking this year, with my 5th grade US history curriculum, we were thinking in terms of introducing at the beginning of the school year, really just kind of introducing the question is who are we the people, and getting students to think about who that is, and in what context is we the people is referring to, who is asking about, or who is the one who's suggesting that phrase, we the people. Does that we the people meaning it's just, landowning white men, and to what extent over the course of history was that expanded to different groups, women, children, indigenous people, African Americans, Hispanic, Latino, and it continues. And so I think that in starting this work, you have to think of the big picture, the macro, at the macro level of the entire curriculum. If that is if that's the direction or the movement you want in your history curriculum, to really be that inclusive, that you have to start at the beginning of the school year to frame that question that students are constantly thinking about it as you move on, so that when you get to, Jacksonian era, you can start asking the question of, what was life like for different groups of people in that time, in the 1820s, 1830s. And then you can kind of present different, perspectives, and it doesn't give the appearance that you're just adding it on. That because you started that question at the beginning of the school year, that students are constantly thinking of the various different perspectives, of groups of people who are living in the United States at that time, then I think you're in a better position to be able to provide all of the different perspectives. So.
Yeah, I wish we had that idea of like those big ideas, right? That should cut through a class really as a way of kind of doing that work, right? And then when we're, so I think a lot about Malcolm Cawthorn, who's a teacher at Brookline High School. Many of you might know Malcolm. And in his US history class, the whole year, they're trying to define what is freedom, who gets freedom, how do they get freedom, right? And that really helps kind of center everything the students are doing, right? Because the other questions we could ask would center around something else, right? So, I think one of the most problematic things that I think has arisen is a misunderstanding of one of the things Sam Weinberg actually came up with. Well, he didn't come up with, but he brought to our field, which is this idea of presentism. And this idea of like, don't judge people in the past on our present kind of views. And in our book, Kaylee and I actually argue, we actually went back and found out who coined the phrase presentism. It's a guy named Carl Becker. And he actually was arguing for he coined the phrase, every man his own historian. He actually meant it to be, use the past to understand your present world, which is amazing to me that this somehow has gotten cycled into like, don't judge people in the past, when he was saying, judge the people in the past to make sense of what we're living through now. And he was kind of a radical, so rethink your future. And I think about that, Gorman, with like our curriculum of like, every unit should be thinking, what does this tell me about my current world? How did this lead to my current world? And if we have those big ideas, I think it will really help. I think Jody had a question, but I don't know how our time is. What time is this session going to?
We got a few minutes. We're good.
Okay, good. Jody, were you going to ask a question, or did you?
Oh yeah, no. I put it in the chat earlier. If I can't wait for your book, like, has some of this come out in article form?
It hasn't yet. I mean, I have articles, and I'm happy to send those. Anybody on this on this group, I'll put my email here. Teacher College Press lets me like send a preview to people. So I'll send you the first chapter so that you can at least read that, and then maybe you'll even consider buying the whole book when it comes out. But yeah, just email my email address there in the chat, and I'll send you the first chapter as a little bit of a preview for what's coming, and then you can take a look at it.